April 14, 1944. Somewhere on the outskirts of Hollandia, New Guinea. The air was heavy with rain and smoke. Palm fronds dripped with the residue of a recent downpour, and somewhere beyond the perimeter, an American generator thudded in rhythmic bursts, the heartbeat of the camp. The war here was still fierce, the jungles alive with echoes of distant artillery. But tonight, inside a makeshift wooden structure covered in canvas, something entirely different was about to unfold. Sergeant Tom Wilkins of the U.S. Army Signal Corps wiped his hands on a rag, crouched beside a bulky bell and howl projector, and gave it a final crank. "All right boys," he muttered, looking to his small team, "let's make Hollywood proud." Across the room, a group of Japanese prisoners, 20 of them, lean and hollow-eyed, sat cross-legged on the bamboo floor. Their uniforms were tattered, still carrying the mud and sweat of battle. Most were quiet, staring blankly at the strange contraption before them. A few whispered to each other in low voices. They didn't understand much English, but they understood power, and this, whatever it was, looked like some kind of American weapon. Private First Class Henry Red Donovan leaned over to one of the guards. "You think they'll even get what they're seeing?" he whispered. The guard shrugged. "Don't matter. Orders are orders. Command wants them to see it." Outside, the jungle hummed. The lights inside dimmed. The hum of the generator deepened into a growl. Then, the screen flickered to life. At first, there was only white light. Then, color. Bright red, deep blue, and soft yellow spilled across the rough canvas screen. The prisoners flinched, several instinctively raising their arms to shield their faces. They had seen motion pictures before, occasionally, Japanese propaganda reels shown in training camps, but those were always in black and white, grainy, and distant. This was something else. It was alive. On screen, smiling American soldiers marched past the camera in crisp khaki uniforms. The colors were vivid, flags fluttering, blue skies radiant above them. A brass band played somewhere off-frame. Narrator's voice, deep and proud, spoke in English, but the Japanese didn't need to understand the words. The tone was clear: confidence, prosperity, ease. In the back row, Corporal Shigeru Tanaka watched, motionless. Just days ago, he'd been pulled from a jungle trench half-starved, bleeding from his leg, and expecting execution. Now he sat under guard, watching a movie that looked as if it belonged to another world entirely. He couldn't comprehend it. How could a nation at war, the same one dropping bombs across the Pacific, have the time, the technology, the sheer luxury to make something so beautiful? The man beside him, Private Nishida, leaned forward, whispering in disbelief. "Color. It's color." Tanaka didn't answer. His eyes were locked on the screen, on the laughing faces, the marching bands, the women waving flags. For a brief moment, he forgot where he was. Sergeant Wilkins glanced at the prisoners, then at his men. "See that?" he murmured. "That's the look of a man who just realized he's been lied to his whole life." The film continued. Scenes of American factories followed, massive steel forges glowing orange, workers smiling as they built aircraft and tanks by the hundreds. Then, images of grocery stores back home, shelves stacked with food, fresh fruit, and tins of coffee. Even the guards went quiet. The Japanese prisoners exchanged uncertain glances. To them, war meant rationing, hunger, and sacrifice. Their own families back home were told that America was a land of chaos and corruption, a place where the people were weak and decadent. But this film said otherwise. One of the younger soldiers, maybe 19 at most, looked utterly lost. He whispered a question to the interpreter nearby, something that made the man hesitate before answering softly in Japanese. Tanaka heard the reply and froze. The question had been simple. "Is this America, now?" The interpreter nodded. When the film ended, the screen went white again, humming faintly as the reel spun down. For a long time, no one spoke. Sergeant Wilkins exhaled, pulling a cigarette from his pocket. "Well," he said quietly, "I'll be damned if that didn't hit harder than a rifle round." The guards began ushering the prisoners back toward their tents. But several lingered, eyes still fixed on the empty screen, as if hoping the images would return. Tanaka stood slowly, his thoughts a blur. He had fought for the emperor, believing the Americans to be monsters. Yet the people in that film, smiling, relaxed, free, looked more human than anything he could remember from home. And somewhere, deep inside him, something began to crack. He didn't yet understand it, but the war had just changed, not by bullet or bomb, but by the flicker of light on a canvas screen. April 15, 1944. The next morning. The jungle mist clung low to the ground as dawn broke over the camp. A thin fog rolled between palm trunks and the rows of U.S. tents. Roosters crowed somewhere among the supply depots, and from the mess area came the smell of coffee and powdered eggs. Inside the fenced prisoner compound, silence lingered, broken only by the rustle of canvas and the occasional cough. The Japanese prisoners sat in small groups, eating their rationed breakfast of rice and tinned meat, still speaking in low voices about what they'd seen the night before. Corporal Tanaka hadn't slept. His mind replayed the colors, the deep blue of the American sky, the shine of sunlight over parading soldiers, the red and white stripes of the flag fluttering freely. It wasn't propaganda to him, it was too real, too casual, too confident. He had grown up believing Japan was the world's greatest power, divinely chosen, unbreakable. Yet, when he'd fought at Buna, when he'd watched his friends die in the mud without food or medicine, that belief had already begun to crumble. The film had shattered the rest. He turned toward Private Nishida, who sat nearby tracing lines in the dirt with a stick. "Did you see the factory?" Tanaka asked quietly in Japanese. Nishida looked up. "Yes. The machines. So many. So many," Tanaka repeated. "And all clean." Nishida frowned, trying to make sense of it. "How do they have the time to make movies during war? We have nothing. No rice, no bullets, and they make films." Tanaka didn't reply. The question hung between them like the humidity in the air. Across the yard, a U.S. Army interpreter, a Nisei named Sergeant Kenji Sato, a Japanese-American born in California, walked toward the prisoners with a clipboard in hand. He greeted the guards with a nod, then called out in fluent Japanese. "Attention! You men will be shown another film tonight. Command wishes to observe your reactions." A murmur swept through the compound. Some prisoners looked away, others leaned forward, curious but wary. One of them shouted, "Why do you show us these things?" Sato turned toward the voice. "Because you were told lies," he said evenly. "You should know the truth about the world outside your islands." Tanaka studied Sato with disbelief. A man who looked like them, spoke their language, yet wore the American uniform proudly. The contradiction was unbearable. When night fell again, the projector buzzed to life once more. This time, the film was lighter, a Technicolor short titled Victory at Sea, Home Front Heroes. It showed American families planting victory gardens, smiling children collecting scrap metal, and workers singing as they built ships. The prisoners watched, transfixed. Sato stood near the back, arms folded, observing their faces. He saw the same expression he'd seen before in other camps, the mix of awe and despair, the slow collapse of certainty. Halfway through the reel, one scene drew an audible gasp, a baseball game in full color. Crowds cheered under the summer sun. Soldiers on leave laughed as the camera panned across them. To the prisoners, it looked like paradise. Private Nishida whispered, "They laugh, even while at war." Tanaka's jaw tightened. His thoughts raced. "We fight to the death. They fight, but they live." When the film ended, Wilkins and his crew packed up the projector again. Sato remained, translating the prisoners' questions for the Americans. One of the Japanese officers, a lieutenant captured near 8 stepped forward and spoke solemnly. "Is this film made from truth?" he asked. Sato replied, "Yes. Shot in America. Not fake." The officer hesitated, then bowed slightly. "Then, your country is stronger than we were told." Sato's face softened. "You'll understand more in time," he said quietly. After the session, the U.S. guards led the prisoners back to their quarters. The night was still, filled with the chirp of insects and the distant sound of trucks moving supplies. Inside the tent, Tanaka lay awake, staring up at the dim outline of the canvas above him. The projector light still burned in his mind. He could no longer picture the world as Japan's leaders had described it, a weak, decaying West ruled by corruption. The Americans he'd seen on film were nothing like that. They were organized, abundant, and alive. The film had not just shown color on a screen. It had shown color in truth. And to men raised in the gray uniformity of imperial propaganda, that truth was both wondrous and terrifying. April 17, 1944. Allied POW camp, Hollandia sector. The American officers called it re-education, though that word never appeared on official documents. On paper, it was psychological evaluation through morale films. But in practice, it was something far more subtle, a battle not fought with bullets, but with images and ideas. Sergeant Wilkins and his film crew had received new reels flown in from Brisbane that morning, Why We Fight, directed by Frank Capra himself, and a few shorts showcasing America's industrial might. Each canister came with instructions from Army intelligence, screened for cooperative POWs only. Observe reactions. Document changes in demeanor. By midday, the small hut once again smelled of oil and ozone as Wilkins tested the projector's lamp. "Let's hope this one doesn't melt," he muttered. Outside, Sergeant Kenji Sato reviewed his notes. He'd spent the past few nights speaking with the prisoners, recording their impressions. Some were confused. Some were skeptical. But many, like Tanaka and Nishida, were visibly shaken, their certainties about Japan's invincibility beginning to erode. To the Americans, these screenings were an experiment. To the prisoners, they were an existential crisis. That evening, as dusk settled, another 20 men were brought in. They sat silently, hands folded, eyes trained on the blank screen. The room was lit only by the projector's bulb, a single glowing eye ready to unspool a new kind of warfare. The film began with the unmistakable voice of a narrator, firm, deliberate, American. This is a war for freedom. A war for civilization. A war that will decide the fate of the world. Images followed, American tanks rolling through North Africa, aircraft carriers slicing across the Pacific, columns of soldiers smiling at the camera. It wasn't just a display of power, it was a vision of purpose. Tanaka sat in the front row this time. His leg wound was healing, and his eyes were sharper now, not with defiance, but with curiosity. He watched as scenes of America's industrial cities flashed by, New York's skyline, Chicago's steel mills, the vast Boeing factory in Seattle producing bombers by the dozen. The sound of hammers and engines filled the room. Men and women, working side by side on assembly lines. He turned to the interpreter and asked softly, "Are women allowed to work there?" Sato nodded. "Yes. They build planes, drive trucks, even serve in the military." Tanaka blinked, trying to process that. In Japan, that would be forbidden. "That's the difference," Sato replied. "Freedom doesn't weaken a country. It makes it unstoppable." The prisoners sat transfixed. On screen, soldiers marched through liberated towns in Italy, greeted by cheering civilians. The music swelled with a kind of triumphant optimism utterly foreign to men raised under the shadow of the rising sun. By the end of the reel, when the credits rolled, the silence in the hut was absolute. Then, quietly, the Japanese lieutenant spoke, "You live like this even during war?" Wilkins, overhearing through Sato's translation, nodded. "That's right. We don't stop living just because there's a war on." The lieutenant stared at him for a long time, then lowered his gaze. "Then we cannot win." No one responded. The generator hummed in the background, the sound of progress, relentless and indifferent. Later that night, as the guards extinguished the lamps, Sato sat outside the compound fence, smoking and thinking. He'd translated for hundreds of prisoners, but something about this group was different. They weren't shouting slogans anymore. They weren't clinging to blind loyalty. They were thinking, deeply, painfully. Inside, Tanaka whispered to Nishida, "I used to believe death for the Emperor was glory. But if our enemy lives in such color, and we die in such darkness." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. For the first time, the two soldiers imagined a Japan that could lose, not because its soldiers were weak, but because its leaders had hidden the truth from them. Outside, lightning flickered over the jungle ridge. Somewhere in the distance, the rumble of Allied artillery rolled faintly like thunder. And in a tent full of captured men, the most devastating weapon of all had already struck, the realization that the enemy wasn't only stronger. He was freer. April 21, 1944. Allied POW camp, Hollandia, New Guinea. The monsoon returned that morning, relentless sheets of rain pounding against the tin roofs, turning pathways into streams of red mud. The camp was quieter now, almost contemplative. The screenings had continued nightly for nearly a week, each film peeling away another layer of conviction from the prisoners who watched. Inside the officer's tent, Captain Raymond Harris of U.S. Army Intelligence leaned over a small wooden desk piled with reports. "So what's your read, Sergeant?" he asked without looking up. Kenji Sato sat opposite him, flipping through his own notebook filled with pages of neat Japanese script. "They're starting to question everything," he said. "Not just their commanders, but the war itself." Harris raised an eyebrow. "That fast?" Sato nodded. "They were told America was starving. That your people were soft, lazy. Then they see that," he gestured toward the projector outside, "and it's like showing a caveman a light bulb. It's not just disbelief. It's shame." The captain leaned back, exhaling a cloud of pipe smoke. "Then the films are working." "Yes," Sato said. "But not how you think. You're not making them love America. You're making them realize Japan lied to them." Outside, the rain slowed to a drizzle. A guard called out orders as a group of prisoners marched toward the mess area. Tanaka was among them, walking slower than the rest, his limp still noticeable. He no longer looked like the defiant soldier captured in the jungle 2 weeks ago. His eyes were clear now, and full of thought. At the mess tent, he sat across from Nishida, who stirred his bowl of watery soup absent-mindedly. "I dreamed about the film," Nishida muttered. "The one with the baseball game. The people cheering. The sound." Tanaka smiled faintly. "It felt alive, didn't it?" Nishida nodded. "Yes. Back home, the only color we see now is blood or rust. My brother wrote to me before I was sent here, said the rice harvest was taken for the army. The children eat bark. But those Americans, they eat meat while they fight." Tanaka looked down at his spoon. "We were told to die for an empire that can't even feed its sons." Neither spoke for a long time. The only sound was the rain against the tent and the distant whine of a generator powering another round of screenings for a new group of prisoners. That night, Tanaka volunteered to assist with setting up the projector. The guards hesitated but allowed it under supervision. He carried the film reels with careful hands, as though holding something sacred. When the first frames flickered across the screen, he stood quietly in the back of the hut, watching not the film, but the faces of the other prisoners. He saw in them the same disbelief, the same slow dawning realization he had felt days before. A scene showed American families gathered in living rooms, laughing at the radio, children playing with tin toys, mothers hanging laundry under bright suburban skies. Tanaka caught himself smiling, not out of envy, but something deeper. Recognition, perhaps, of what life could be when not chained to fanaticism. After the screening, he approached Sato hesitantly. "Sergeant," he said in careful English, "may I ask, these films, why you show to us?" Sato studied him for a moment. "Because we want you to understand what you were fighting against, and what you could have, if peace ever comes." Tanaka frowned. "Peace," he repeated the word softly, as though testing its weight. "In my country, peace means surrender. No, Sato said. Peace means living. The words hung between them. Tanaka bowed slightly, then turned away. For the first time since capture, he didn't feel humiliated. He felt awake. In the following days, the camp atmosphere began to shift. Fewer prisoners barked nationalist slogans. Some even asked to learn English from the Nisei interpreters. One officer requested to see the films again, for study. Captain Harris noted it all in his report. Exposure to American film has profound psychological effect. Prisoners display signs of cognitive dissonance, questioning propaganda fed to them by imperial command. Recommend expansion of program. But what Harris didn't note, what no one could quite measure, was the quiet transformation inside the minds of men like Tanaka. Each reel of color, each smiling face, each glimpse of a world without obedience and starvation, it was rewriting everything they believed about honor, loyalty, and truth. They had seen America's greatest weapon, and it wasn't the B-29 or the Sherman tank. It was the idea that life could be brighter than death. April 28, 1944. Hollandia POW camp. The jungle had turned quiet after days of rain. Mist rose from the drenched earth, curling through the palm trees and coiling over the tents like steam from an open wound. Morning formation had ended, and the prisoners moved about in subdued silence. Something intangible had changed among them, not in posture or behavior, but in their eyes. They no longer looked like soldiers waiting for rescue. They looked like men waiting for understanding. Sergeant Kenji Sato had noticed it too. Each day, the questions grew less hostile, more curious. How do Americans choose their leaders? Are all people free to speak against government? Do your soldiers write to their mothers? It wasn't defiance. It was awakening. That afternoon, Tanaka and Nishida were summoned by name. 2 guards escorted them to the intelligence tent, where Captain Harris and Sato waited beside a table cluttered with notes and film canisters. Harris gestured for them to sit. You've both seen several films now, he began through Sato's translation. We'd like to know what you think. Tanaka hesitated before answering. They are beautiful, he said slowly in Japanese. Too beautiful. Like a dream. Hard to believe such places exist in wartime. They do, Sato said quietly. Those are real people. Real cities. Nishida, who had remained silent, spoke next. If your country is so rich, so strong, why show these films to us? Harris folded his hands. Because strength isn't only about power. It's about purpose. We want you to see that the world you were told to destroy, has more life in it than you were ever allowed to live. The interpreter's words landed like stones in still water. Tanaka looked at him for a long time. In Japan, we were taught that to die for the emperor is the highest honor. Sato nodded. And what did it bring you? Tanaka's eyes fell to the floor. Graves. Hunger. And now, this. Silence filled the tent, thick, heavy, and human. Harris reached for one of the film reels on his desk, labeled The March of Time, America at War. He rolled it gently in his hands. We've got another showing tonight, he said. You can watch if you like. But you don't have to. Tanaka exchanged a glance with Nishida. They both nodded. We'll come. That evening, the projector flickered to life once more. The film opened with a montage of America's coastlines, vast ports crowded with ships, cities glowing with electric light, trains streaking across the plains. The prisoners watched, spellbound. This was no longer the strange, terrifying magic of their first screening. Now it was something deeper, a longing. The sight of abundance and movement, of people laughing under neon signs, of theaters open even in wartime, it stirred a quiet ache inside them. At one point, the film showed a parade of women in factory uniforms, Rosie the Riveter posters in the background, singing as they marched to work. The colors blazed like sunlight through glass. Tanaka whispered, "They fight with happiness." Nishida nodded. "And we fight with fear." Behind them, Sato observed in silence, his arms crossed. He'd seen the same expression a dozen times before, the moment when ideology gives way to humanity. When the colors stop being propaganda, and start being possibility. When the reel ended, there was no applause, no chatter, only quiet breathing. The light from the projector cast long shadows across the prisoners' faces, all staring into the blank white screen as though seeing themselves reflected there. Sato stepped forward. "You may go," he said softly in Japanese. No one moved. Finally, Tanaka spoke. "Sergeant, will there ever be color in Japan?" Sato hesitated before replying. "Someday," he said. "When the war ends, and the truth is allowed to live." Tanaka bowed slightly, not out of obedience, but respect. Later that night, after the guards locked the compound gates, Tanaka lay awake listening to the rain begin again. The jungle was black outside, but in his mind, he still saw the colors, the parades, the laughter, the light. He thought of his family back in Osaka, of his mother's faded kimono, of his father's cracked hands from working in the shipyard, of his younger sister who once dreamed of being a teacher. He wondered if they would ever see the world he had just witnessed on the canvas. And for the first time in years, he whispered a prayer, not for victory, not for death, but for peace. Because now he understood something the war could never teach him. The enemy's greatest weapon was not firepower, but freedom, and the beauty to imagine a world worth living in. May 2, 1944. Hollandia POW Camp, New Guinea. The sun broke through the mist for the first time in days. The monsoon clouds thinned, and the light fell golden and sharp over the rows of tents. To most of the Allied soldiers, it was just another morning, the usual grind of rations, roll call, and paperwork. But inside the POW compound, something was shifting beneath the surface. The screenings had continued, but they were no longer forced. The Japanese prisoners now asked when the next film would be shown. Some even helped assemble the projection equipment. And though they didn't yet know the term psychological warfare, they were living proof of its success. Sergeant Kenji Sato stood at the edge of the compound fence, clipboard under his arm, watching as Tanaka and several others swept the yard. They worked in silence, but their movements were calm, unguarded. The fire of defiance that had once defined them had cooled into something gentler, curiosity. When Sato approached, Tanaka straightened and bowed slightly. "Sergeant," he said in Japanese, "tonight, another film?" Sato smiled faintly. "Yes. A new one came in from headquarters." Tanaka nodded. "Good. I want to see." He paused, then added quietly, "It feels peaceful. When the light starts." Sato studied him for a moment. The man standing before him was no longer the proud imperial soldier who'd spat at guards 2 weeks ago. He looked like someone caught between two worlds, his past breaking apart, his future still unknown. That night's film was This Is America, 1944. A morale reel meant for troops overseas. It showed farmers plowing wide fields of gold wheat, students filling classrooms, and jazz bands playing for soldiers on leave. The footage was saturated with warmth, every frame bursting with the kind of color that seemed to promise more than victory, it promised life. As the film played, Tanaka found himself smiling without realizing it. The camera followed a group of young men laughing in a diner, sharing milkshakes before heading off to war. He didn't understand all the English words, but he understood the tone, hope. When the film ended, the prisoners remained seated, unwilling to return to the grayness outside. The projector hummed softly in the still air, its light fading to white, then to nothing. Sato switched off the generator, plunging the hut into dimness. "That's all for tonight," he said gently. But Tanaka didn't move. "Sergeant," he began, his voice low. "When I was a boy, my teacher said America was a land of greed. That you had no soul. No honor. He looked at the screen, still faintly glowing in the dark. Now I think, maybe we were the ones without soul. Sato's throat tightened. You were soldiers, doing what you were told. Tanaka shook his head. No. We were believers. Blind believers. And you, he gestured toward the projector, you fight with truth. For a moment, neither spoke. The sound of crickets filled the night, and somewhere in the distance, an aircraft engine droned faintly, a reminder that the war beyond the jungle still burned on. Finally, Sato said, one day, when this is all over, your country will see these colors too. And maybe you'll help them understand what they mean. Tanaka looked at him, puzzled. You think Japan will ever see such things? Sato smiled sadly. I think they'll have to. No empire lasts forever. But beauty, freedom, those do. Weeks passed. News from the front lines filtered in, Allied victories in Hollandia, American landings at Saipan, the slow tightening of the noose around the Pacific. The prisoners heard bits and pieces, but by then, few of them spoke with hatred. They asked questions instead, about democracy, about newspapers, about how Americans could criticize their own leaders and not be imprisoned. One afternoon, Tanaka helped the projection team mend a torn film reel. His hands, once trained for rifles, now worked delicately with tape and light. As the reel turned between his fingers, he said to Sato, in the film, the children laugh so easily. I forgot what that sounds like. Sato nodded. Then maybe that's what peace sounds like. Tanaka smiled faintly. Then I hope I hear it again, one day. June 1944. The screenings ended as the camp prepared to relocate prisoners further inland. The projector was packed away, its lens covered, its reels stored in weatherproof crates. When the guards came for them, Tanaka turned one last time toward the empty hut where the films had been shown. It was dark now, silent except for the rustle of leaves in the humid breeze. He stood there for a long moment before bowing slightly toward the door. Arigato, he whispered. To the Americans, it had been a routine propaganda exercise, one among hundreds conducted across the Pacific. But for the men who'd sat cross-legged on that bamboo floor, it had been something far more profound, the first glimpse of a world in color, and the realization that the greatest empire they had ever known was not measured in conquest, but in creation. And long after the projector's light faded, that color, that brief vision of freedom, stayed alive in their minds. For some, it became the seed of change. For others, it became the first step toward peace.